Hello, BookTube. Sorry once again, I'll preface with an apology if you hear background noise. That is my puppy, who is either hurling around a chew toy or furiously destroying my day's mail packages. One or the other. She's amusing herself in the run-up to a nice long walk that we're going to take. In the meantime, I wanted to make a video, a discussion with Karl, because just recently, Karl Anderson uploaded fascinating discussion of positive and negative book reviews. And, of course, I had to get involved. I'm intimately connected with the subject. I've written positive book reviews, and I've also written my share of cuttingly negative book reviews. And, of course, I will leave a link to his discussion because it was so good, so multifaceted, that I won't be able to touch on more than a couple of things. But I felt like I wanted to respond because I'm not on the sidelines on this issue. I have actually had to grapple personally with the point of positive or negative reviews and what warrants them. Eric pointed out in his video that he is himself largely a positive reviewer, and that's absolutely true. And there's also absolutely nothing wrong with that. When you're a reviewer as as smart and perceptive as he is, and you are mostly a positive reviewer, the negative reviews are going to be your silence a lot of the time. And that can be damning. So it can be very effective. I myself don't have that kind of self-control. I need to sound off when I don't like a book. And I wanted to talk briefly about the circumstances under which I think that is justified to do. Of course, Eric's right in his implication that it's never right to do it because the author has written a book that you don't think they should have written, or not the kind of book you would have written on the subject. And it's also, I might point out, for people who aren't listening, the hordes and hordes of idiots at Goodreads, I should point out that it's also wrong to give a negative review of a book because you don't like something the author said at an interview or at a staged event or on Twitter. And it's also, of course, completely wrong to give a negative or a positive review of a book you haven't read. Leaving aside the egregious cases like that don't really concern us, I wanted to talk briefly about reasons for giving a negative review of a book. And they're basically, in a very broad brush way, there are two reasons. One is something that Eric kind of surprised me by touching on in his video, which is that sometimes a book can pick up an enormous amount of uncritical topspin by people, critics and otherwise, just sort of piling on with praise of it, so that not so much a negative review, but rather an objective, a stock-taking review, is an effort on the part of the reviewer to sort of slow the train down, because that kind of acclaim can sell the book to people solely on its own merit, without any reference to the book at all. And people who buy books because of bandwagon jumping, because of massive universal sing unburied sing, acclaim, homegoing acclaim, almost always, in my experience, end up disappointed by what they read. Not only because no book can live up to the hype, but because the hype of that kind, I have found, usually accrues to books that don't merit it. So it's a double whammy. For somebody who buys it for that reason, there's virtually no chance they're going to like it. And certainly not to the extent that it was sold to them. So that when a book starts to garner absolutely universal praise, just completely universal praise. So Homegoing, for instance, was not only on the best fiction list, every single best fiction list by anyone other than me, anywhere in the entire world, not just the English-speaking world, but the entire world, for its year of publication. But some critics and critical organs were so firmly on the bandwagon that they put it not only on best fiction, but on best nonfiction, and in one case, best documentary, when it's not that. When the author would agree to that, they literally could not praise it enough. An absolutely lukewarm semi-failure of a book. It could not be praised highly enough or often enough. And, a reader who isn't completely plugged into the critosphere and saw all that might think, well, this is the bee's knees. I have to read this. Everybody says it's great. In a circumstance like that, a critic might be justified in taking a step back and saying, well, look, this is universally praised, but here are a couple of things that are wrong with it. Here are a couple of things where if you don't like X, Y, or Z when an author does it, you're not going to like that part of this book. Well, look who has tired herself out. Well, that's rough justification number one, for not so much a negative review as sort of just a momentum stalling review. But then, in my experience, there's a reason for an actual negative review where you attack the book in question. And that reason is a fault of the author, where the author is either wrong or credulous or lying, and has written a book under that weight. And you, as a reader, want you command an audience. Like, for instance, Eric has a book blog, The Lonesome Reader. In addition to his YouTube channel, he has a book blog, and his book blog is one of the best book blogs in the world. He has an audience of the people who he's built the audience through a lot of hard work, a lot of dedication, and that means something. And you could say that with anybody who has an audience. They build it with their critical integrity. It's not possible to go out and buy reader bots. You have to build that audience with your critical integrity. And that means one reader at a time has to read something you say about a book, then read the book and think either that critic was entirely right, or even if I don't completely agree with that critic, they were well worthwhile to read about this book, and come back. That it is a slow process to build, so it's not a cheap coin. And therefore, you should pay it. It's your duty to use that when an author is trying, consciously or unconsciously, to mislead their readers. So, for instance, it can take the form of sloppiness, or ivory tower blinkered vision, or simple categorical error. One of the examples that I always come up with is Steven Pinker, whose book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, argues with fuzzy statistical tables and cooked books that mankind is actually getting more and more peaceful. And that the reason for that is because mankind is getting more and more intelligent. That is the general gist of The Better Angels of Our Nature. And the book sold like hotcakes, and it convinced a lot of people who saw his credentials as an Ivy League academic and saw the tables and the charts and maybe read his admittedly extremely nice prose and allowed those things to combine to make them abandon their reason. So as a critic, if you have an audience, when you read something like that, you're duty-bound to bash that book. You're duty-bound to say, I know you're all loving this, but this is garbage. The 2nd century BC, the 4th century AD, the 6th century AD, the 10th century AD, the 18th century AD, each one of those centuries and all the others had maybe 2, maybe 3 examples of what we call now genocide. The 20th century had 18 examples of that, and the 21st century we're up to 4, and it's only 2018. Mankind is most certainly, demonstrably, categorically not getting more peaceful. and I don't know how many, leaving aside the fact that the United States elected Donald Trump as its president in the age of mass communication and instantaneous dissemination of information, leaving that aside, I don't know how many YouTube videos you need to watch about people texting their way into shopping mall water fountains or open manholes before you start to think that maybe Pinker's conclusion that humanity is getting smarter might not be right. In the 21st century, right now, in this exact moment in the 21st century, I would respond to that contention with 2 words: Tide Pods. In other words, the basic ideological underpinning of The Better Angels of Our Nature was pure hogwash. And when you see that as a critic, you absolutely have to step in and bash the book. And the same thing is true with the negative side, the darker side of that, where it's not sloppy thinking or incompetence or a blinkered Panglossian idealization of the charts and statistics or whatever, but actual willing deceit, where someone is actively trying to deceive their readers. And books like that also need to be negatively reviewed. They need to be bashed, attacked. And that's mostly nonfiction, but it can happen in fiction too. What exactly the author is trying to deceive the reader about in fiction might be a little cloudier, but it can still happen. Fiction, novels, can still be lies. I mean, they're all stories, but they can still be trying to deceive you. And whether it's fiction or nonfiction, when you see that actual mendacity, and you have an audience, you're behooved to write a negative review. If somebody writes a book claiming all sorts of facts that aren't right, and doing it for maybe an ideological slant or something like that, you have to attack it. I was thinking of all this in response to Eric's video, in addition to all that he said, because of something that he conveyed. He conveyed a metaphor that his beloved Joyce Carol Oates, he is in the perilous but I think admirable position of being the #1 fan of a living great author. You'll notice that I might love texting some living authors, but I don't think I would go so far out on a limb as he does. He's on completely firm ground with Joyce Carol Oates, but still, it's risky. And he related a story of hers about a metaphor about being a writer, that you walk up to the bank of a river and you put your feet in, and it looks doable to swim across. It looks placid. So you wade your way in, and then you start to swim, and the river turns out to be much gnarlier and more ferocious than you thought, and it starts to take everything you've got just to keep swimming. And you do, and your arms are like lead, and eventually, miraculously, you reach the other bank, and you crawl your way up onto the bank of the river, and you and you flop onto the shore, exhausted, and there's a critic standing right there saying, "That's not exactly how I would have done it." And okay, when she originally made the metaphor, it made me chuckle. When Eric retold it, it made me chuckle. But I have to point out, the metaphor is wrong. The metaphor is exactly the kind of metaphor that you would make about the process if you yourself were a writer and not a critic. In order to make the metaphor correct, you would have to change it just a bit, so that the swimmer, before they enter the river, tells everybody that they're going to swim the river really well and charges everybody $35 to watch. That's what you would have to do to change the metaphor to make it accurate. And what happens at the end, when the person hauls himself out on the further bank, is that the critic says, well, that wasn't worth the money that you charged these people in order to see you do that. And also, you've done this 10 times before, and that was by far the worst river swimming that you've ever done. and that's the whole point. When Joyce Carol Oates told the story, it was to stress that critics are just idle carpers. They won't do the work themselves. They'll just sort of poo-poo on your efforts to do it. But, that would only apply if a critic was coming into your home and making those comments about a manuscript that you had tucked in your desk. And that's not true. When you are an author, you are a public figure putting wares out into the market. Critics are the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration. They're at least my kind of critic. I leave to others the higher kind of intellectual artsy-fartsy critic who is judging for all time. I'm not judging for all time. I'm judging for you. And those critics are like the FDA in that they're saying, here's a book, here's what's right about it, here's what's wrong about it. They're not going out of their way to stand on the riverbank and bash the people who cross it. They're standing on the riverbank in order to tell people from the next town over whether or not they should get in their cars, drive over, and pony up their money to watch the swimming. Anyway, I wanted to put my 2 cents in about positive and negative. I myself love praising books. I don't know if that always comes across on this channel or in print, but I actually love praising books. There are hundreds of thousands of books that are published every year in the English language. there are tens of thousands of them. Even if you pare away all the kinds of the categories and kinds of books that don't matter, or that only matter to an audience that's going to buy them anyway, like auto manuals or phone books or whatever. Even if you pare away all of those, you're still left with tens of thousands of books. A sea of books, and that's just I'm talking about the printed stuff. That doesn't even take into account the even bigger now extra sea of self-published electronic stuff. In such an absolute, deafening, blinding, smothering torrent of books, it's a distinct pleasure, a privilege, to be able to pluck one out of that massive torrent and actually say to your audience, this is worth reading. That's thrilling. So I don't consider that a loss at all. But I do, unlike a lot of my critical brethren, I do also think it's absolutely incumbent on you to remember that anybody can encounter any of those books by accident, and all of those books come with PR. So in a way, even though there's a torrent that lowers the odds of anybody finding anything at all, you still have to be a watchdog, because somebody could still come across a book that says, here at 150 pages is the very first complete and comprehensive history of the battle of my life. You're a critic, you're standing right there, and you're saying, no, that's not true. I've read 20 histories. And I also noticed from your bibliography that you've consulted no original sources and no non-English language sources. As a critic, it's your job to tell people that. It's your job to warn people based on your experience what might or might not be worth their time. What's wrong with what they are considering spending their time and money on. So I wanted to get those thoughts out there, but I want to make sure to ask as well. Because Eric mentioned in his video one thing that has always fascinated me, which is that sometimes a negative review will prompt you to read the book. I know that's happened in my own case. There have been books that I have bashed right up and down the church aisle, and then I get written to by readers saying, I know you said I shouldn't, but I can't resist. Just based on your review, I can't resist reading this book to see what got you so upset. And I've very seldom had it happen that readers would do that and then come back to me and say, I think you were wrong. No, they usually come back and say, no, you were right. That was a stinkeroo, but I had to read it because of your review. I want to know from you, what role in your reading life do negative reviews play, if any? I know some of you have written to me and said, I don't read reviews of any kind. And I go, ooh. But I think, no, they're not pointing that at you. They're just saying they don't do it just in general. Some of you have said that to me. Others have said that you don't read negative reviews. So I'm curious to know, what role in your reading world do negative reviews play? Like, for instance, if we flip it over for just a second, I won't keep this going too long. If we flip it over for just a second, is it, for instance, true for some of you that you don't trust a reviewer who is only positive? Eric sort of hinted at that in his own video. Do you read a reviewer who always cheers the books that he reviews and think, well, he likes everything? When, as I've said, from those numbers, those publishing numbers, it's absolutely not true that such a critic likes everything. Such a critic can no more approach everything than I can. It might be that they're deciding to cheer on the things from that torrent that they like and just ignore the stuff they don't like. I myself don't like to take that route completely, because the stuff I ignore could still find a reader, fool a reader, deceive a reader, cheat a reader out of time or money or both. But I want to know from you, what speaking as a critic here, and I don't know that if Eric would use the word on himself, but he is one, and not everybody is. Plenty of readers that I email every day are perfectly content to be readers without being critics. So I want to know, especially from those readers, what role does any of this play in your own reading? Are you, for instance, the type of reader who encounters a new book and immediately looks to see what the reviews are? And does that ever tip you over the edge onto whether or not you will or will not buy a book or read a book? Anyway, you get my point. I'm going to go tend to a puppy now. But I wanted to get in a video on this because it's my heart and soul. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.